Homeschool parents, this is a message for you. As a homeschooler, I know you work hard for us. You have many different things to manage.
Our Thinking, Feeling, Willing program is your roadmap to a successful Waldorf homeschool journey. Gain the confidence you need to be the teacher your child wants and transform your homeschool experience. Homeschooling with Waldorf Essentials is one like no other. You not only have curriculum options, you can also add our Thinking, Feeling, Willing program onto your curriculum. What's in the Thinking, Feeling, Willing program? Rhythm, inner work, temperament, the Waldorf curriculum, learning and strengthening your skills in music, circle time, form drawing, handwork, painting, drawing, modeling, festivals, reading, writing, spelling, eurythmy and movement, and our bonus content. Something else you'll get when you join Waldorf Essentials that you will not find anywhere else is the community, and we all need that as homeschoolers.
This is your invitation to fill your cup. We know you're rooting for us. We are rooting for you too.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Stephanie. I am so excited to introduce you to our audience. I think that this topic is a huge topic that obviously is not widely discussed. I've been in Waldorf for nearly 20 years, and I know about this much, tiny bit. So I'm really excited. You had commented on one of my posts, and I was like, let's figure out who she is and how we can talk to her, because I think it's an important topic. And I think there are so many parents that are struggling with children that I think this could be a really good doorway to open for them. So please introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and sort of a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do with Retained Reflexes.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you again. It's always wonderful when those little human connections are made, even on a cold format, right?
Right? That's a little redeeming, right?
It really is. It really is. So thank you. I'm excited to be able to talk about this too. And my name is Stephanie Ferris. I'm a kindergarten teacher at Wishing Well Waldorf School in Los Osos, California. We're on the Central Coast, near to San Luis Obispo is probably a name that some people might recognize. So I've been teaching for over a decade, and in the early childhood specifically. And I came to Waldorf education, as just previously, through my children, and many of us do come that way. And I prefaced the conversation by saying that I too, my children are 21 and 26 now, so they've fledged the nest, so to speak. But I feel like I'm just at the very beginning of learning about this as well. And though I've been studying this for years, there's always something new and something next. In fact, I started a training just yesterday with a woman named Sonia story. We can talk a little bit more about that later, because I would love to provide her as a resource.
Absolutely.
But having this information come from a wealth of different lenses and angles has been really helpful. So really, my work began with Dr. Adam Blanning, and this book, though it's a hefty one. It's like a Bible, and it's like most anthroposophically based text. It's you really got to work through it. But I started to look at child development through the lens of child development with that specific just beauty that is anthroposophy and Waldorf education.
Right.
And, we're, as teachers, I think more and more seeing children who are coming to us, whether they're our own children coming to us in a homeschooling environment, or they're coming to us in classrooms, who are just really having a hard time finding a home in their physical body. And we know that the way that we incarnate into our physical bodies and really penetrate to the very tips of our fingers and toes is through movement, and through movement alone. The way that the brain develops is through movement, and it's so simple. And so then you have to wonder, you take a moment to wonder, okay, are our children moving less these days? And yes, of course, we know that they are. Are they participating in family life the way they once did, where children were very essential? They were an essential part of the team. Right. They were responsible for carrying things, sweeping things, and all of these movements.
All of those things.
Absolutely. And all of those things help to integrate reflexes. So we're doing less of that. Children are also, for convenience and safety, being placed in carriers and bouncy swings, and even, baby wearing that isn't allowing the child to get down onto the floor and get into these primitive movement patterns that we've all come pre-programmed with so that our brain can develop. And so we're seeing things like postural problems, children who have a really hard time sitting up or standing up, sitting at the table, falling out of their chairs. Circle time can be really increasingly chaotic for many teachers because the children they can't imitate, they can't get through the circle. They're out of sorts. And so investigating why is that happening and how can we help to support that is something that I've become extremely interested in, because if you don't feel good in your body, if you feel dizzy, if you can't see, if you're not processing the messages that are coming through your auditory system, what a scary feeling for a little child who can't actually communicate that that's what they're feeling to us.
They're trying to really incarnate into their body. And if they just don't feel like they can, what is their option is to look like they're running around crazy, which is what, if an untrained eye would be like, oh no, get that child under control. But if they can't settle, then there's work that we have to do.
That's right. And, it's even, it's such an impact to a child's life and their self-esteem when these behaviors then go on to become issues with social emotional abilities, with the ability to receive educational instruction when they do enter into the grade school, when they're diagnosed with things like ADHD, ADD, autism spectrum, anxiety disorder. The list goes on, and so many of these things at the root is a reflex that has not retained. It's still active much longer than when it's supposed to be, and it's getting in the way. And if we can, with just very simple but consistent movement, get those to integrate, get those to go back to sleep, it'll always be there in our brainstem, but we don't want it to be actively getting in the way. Then these symptoms, it's miraculous how they just melt away and sometimes completely and totally disappear. So it's big, it's really big stuff.
It's very interesting to me. I've worked, when I lived in California, we had a very large co-op and I was a leader. We probably had between 40 and 50 children at any one time. And you can, as a mother of special needs children, you can see it, right? Like you can watch and you can see the kids, they're like, oh, this one's struggling, this one's struggling. And if you're not paying attention to that, then it starts to change how you think about that child. But if you know what's going on, you understand what's going on, then you can have more compassion for that child, which is, I find, not so much now, but 10 years, 15 years ago, it's really hard to have compassion for somebody else's child sometimes if they have no boundaries and you can see that the parent is really struggling. But with this idea, you can really bring this in and bring it to groups that you're working with, with regards to maybe a co-op setting, definitely with your own children. Tell me what happens what happens educationally with this child if they don't have their retained reflexes worked with when they're in those kinder years, because that's really ideally, right, is kinder and younger to get those taken care of so that they don't have those struggles as they're growing up.
Yes, it really is. And one of the things I think that impacted me the most as a parent before I took up the path of teaching in the Waldorf schools was a teacher presenting one time said, as Waldorf educators, our job is to remove obstacles to learning. And so a retained reflex is an obstacle to learning. And oftentimes it's a really big obstacle. So again, it can look like social emotional issues. It can look like the inability to regulate oneself. Impulse control can be an issue. It can look like ADHD, ADD. It can look like autism spectrum. It can look like anxiety. It can look like auditory and visual processing issues. Struggle with reading, dyslexia, dysgraphia, handwriting. So you can see that the list is, it's pretty broad. It's pretty broad. And then there's just the feeling that we have as adults. And so we're so great as adults in compensating and overcompensating. So many, if not all of us, have these retained reflexes, and it could just come out and I feel this underlying anxiety. And here you think you have an anxiety disorder, or maybe you want some medicine for that. And if you just integrated that reflex, it sounds ridiculously simple, but that's what's so exciting about it, I think.
I'm 100% in agreement, because I do think that increasingly we live in this space where we just have a culture that wants to just say, here's a pill, here, just fix this. And I've always been a no pills without skills person. Like, if you're going to end up taking those pills, that's fine, but we need to give you the skills. Let's see if we can work with this in another way so that you don't always need those pills. Because, when I hear of a parent, and no judgment, but when I have a parent that says, we had to medicate ADHD at age 7, I think, okay, let's think that through, because they're 7 now. What happens when they're 27, when they're 37, when they're 70? Are they still going to be on this medication? And if there are things that we can do to lessen that medication or eliminate it completely, we should exhaust those, opportunities completely.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And oftentimes, if we have the tools to do this, it's free. So you're also saving money.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm all about not giving pharmaceutical companies any more money.
They've
All
got
about that. All about that. Let's save it for where it's needed. That care,
Absolutely.
and really work with what we can otherwise, because movement is so important. And I think even beyond retained reflexes, we have to keep moving. I follow this guy on Instagram, Dr. Tommy John, which a lot of people think he's crazy, and he might be just a little bit, but he says, injured human, move. Like, all of us humans need to move. If you're injured, you need to move the most. So we have to, as adults, sort of get that mindset. And I'm a huge proponent of, when people say, oh, my kids aren't behaving, I go, let's talk about how much you're moving. Are you moving? In a Waldorf school, they're moving like a third or more of their day. And so we need to, if we're homeschooling, we really need to integrate that into our homeschooling. And that could be arrhythmia. That could be, an outside class. It could just be plenty of walking and running and hiking and all of those things, and biking that we do as people every day. But if your child is struggling, I think it's really important to look at this. So how old do you think is too old to correct this? Like, if I had some retained reflexes at 50, could they be integrated now?
Yes. Yes, they can. I think what's really exciting about this new course that I'm taking with Sonia's story, and I just want to make sure I don't get this wrong because it's so new to me, but and I'll bring this up again,
Sure.
but it's called Move, Play, Thrive is her program. So what I've always understood to be true, and now I'm learning that maybe it's not quite that, is that it's always easier, first of all, not to miss these developmental movements in the first place. So if a baby is allowed to be and is allowed to struggle to get into that new position, that's the ideal thing. We don't want to have to intervene. But again, for whatever reason, and there are many different reasons, and no judgment there either, that's not happening for many. And what Sonia was saying yesterday is that this can be used all the way through the very end of life. And what's super cool is that if you have a brain injury or an accident, trauma,
I had a stroke 9 years ago. So
yes,
I'm all about listening to this now.
Yes, they will actually use primitive movements to help in stroke rehabilitation, to help with Parkinson's, to help with elders. So yes, and they come back to help us in times of trauma, but they get in the way of us living our lives and of our brain communicating seamlessly with all of the different parts of itself. So yes, yeah.
I think that's beautiful. I think for all of our families that are listening, if you're an adult you've just been diagnosed with autism, or you've just been diagnosed with ADHD as an adult, which I think is so hard often, because we're like, I lived my whole life and now there's this. But I think it's really important that you take a look at this then, because there are some things that, again, even if you don't end up walking away from any medication you're taking, maybe it could lessen it, or at least, the very least, help you feel happy in your body, which is so important.
Yes. Well, and Sonia was talking also yesterday, and I've heard this to be true with many people who have gone through her program, and many educators that work with the special lesson or the extra lesson book or remedial education, that by going through these trainings and actually redoing the movements yourself, they're self-diagnosing that, oh my gosh, yes, I have these retained reflexes. And when you are able to consistently use these tools of movement, the difference that it makes in your life, though you didn't even know you needed a difference to be made, so giant, right? That's where we start to get very excited and a little bit
Right.
missionary about the whole thing, because it's really, really amazing.
That is really beautiful. So tell me, you mentioned the extra lesson. There are a lot of great exercises in there that I did with my oldest that has autism that were incredibly helpful. Is this along that line, or is this like in addition to, I don't want to say more important than, but like just part of this whole space?
Yes, I think that something that was really I found to be fascinating. I'm working with a woman named Marjorie Raybach, and she has a private practice. She's in Olympia, Washington, but will be moving to this area. And she was talking to me about the extra lesson. She took the extra lesson training and worked for many, many years in the Waldorf School as a consultant and a teacher. And she said, in working with the extra lesson book, it's wonderful and it's great and it was helpful, but there was something more that it wasn't addressing, and it was such a mystery to her. And as she started to learn about the primitive and postural reflexes, that's where things started to click. And Sonia's story, it's not a Waldorf-based program, but so far, and again, I've just started yesterday, I feel like it's very easy to understand, and the practical application comes faster than in some of the anthroposophical lensed approaches.
Sure, because that's got a specific lens, right? Like the anthroposophical lens, we're talking about how all of the bodies integrate. And so, when you're looking at it from that perspective, I think it's probably incredibly helpful. But looking at it from a mainstream perspective might be a little bit easier as you're walking into this, I would imagine.
And it does make it easier to have conversations too with really anybody,
Sure.
because not everyone is well versed in anthropos if you're a Waldorf education. But I think it's really important to have lots of different language to be able to talk to lots of different people about something especially this important.
Right. Very good. So how would I know if my child had retained reflexes?
Yeah. So, I mean, the symptoms, which I've mentioned lots of them already, are pretty much across the board, including a child who's continuing to have potty accidents at night.
You'd mentioned that. And you know what? My oldest, he was 9 before he was done. That's so interesting. And I always attributed it to the fact that I horribly, before I knew better, let him cry it out. So I was like, oh, well,
Right.
as he'll sleep through anything.
Right.
Oh my goodness.
Right.
So potty accidents after 6 or 7?
Potty accidents after 6 or 7, absolutely. Fear of the dark. A lot of the reflexes are very closely associated, and it's all a part of the same system with sensory integration. So a lot of things that you would see that are tricky for the vestibular system, the proprioceptive system, or the tactile systems, all of those things completely and totally connected to reflexes. So if you have a child who struggles with balance, has needs to move fast, children that go fast are compensating for a really underdeveloped balance system. Again, when we're seeing children either sit at the table, at their desk, the slumping, you see these desks that are, kind of like this. And then here's an interesting one. So I had a child sitting next to me one day at snack, and she turned her head this way, and her spoon full of snack came right to my body. Well, later on, I learned that that's connected to a retained reflex, the ATNR, and the head and the arm will follow and are connected. So now in the grade school, if you've got a desk partner, these children are often accused of being bullies, be annoying or distracting, or a child could be, accused of being disruptive.
Right.
Reading difficulties, right? Dyslexia, we talked about.
What about when they're really little? I mean, if the mom is listening now and she's got a 3, 4, or 5-year-old, is there anything she can be looking for now before we get to that space of, actual in the older grades?
Absolutely. And I think, especially when our children are little, these precious little brand new gifts that we just want to do the best job with. And we hope we are, but we secretly suspect that we're not, and we're not because we're human.
Right.
But I think I know the tendency can be to get a little obsessive of watching, right? Like when we go into our baby and they're sleeping and it's like, are they breathing? Is this,
Right. All places. Right.
Yeah, I think a really good place to start is just by allowing your baby to move. right? So if you are allowing your baby to have plenty of floor time, you're not propping your baby up into a position that they can't already get into. This is huge, right? So I didn't know this when I was had little children, and I propped my little guy up, and it was so cute to see him sitting as this teeny weeny little thing, but that's getting in the way of his body and his brain working together, sending messages about body geography, where you are in space. It also is preventing that core from being developed. And we think about core strength as far as like in terms of exercise and fitness, but we need our core for so many different reasons, including social emotional reasons, which seems very disconnected. But when you learn more about the brain and child development, it really, these things do come together. So a baby that might be struggling with this or not getting enough of this floor time or the opportunities to get themselves into these different positions, we see parents walking their baby hands before they actually have been able to get up into that upright position themselves and struggle against gravity, develop those muscles that help against gravity. So you'll see babies that have a really flow, right? I mean, they're checking these reflexes at birth, of course. It's like baby up by their hands, by their arms. Instead of having that tone where their head comes forward, it would just be really floppy, right? So you're also looking at crawling. Did your baby crawl? And some babies skip it. We don't always know why.
Right. My oldest with autism skipped it. And when I
Right.
learned that he needed to crawl, I was like, oh no, we need to go back and crawl.
Right.
Right.
Well, in an occupational therapy, they call crawling the great integrator. So, one of the things I learned in my teacher training, and this was years and years and years ago, before we really knew as much as we do now about retained reflexes. But they said, if you don't do anything else in your circle time, crawl, have the children crawl. And you'll see that children, like in our classrooms, often you get a bunch of little early childhood children together and they want to be doggies, they want to be kitties. So they have this natural desire to move in the way that will develop their brain. So if we don't get in the way, and one of the things I love talking about in my parent meetings when we're talking about media, because that's a tricky topic too, your child is consuming media, they're not moving. So it's another great reason why, especially, in those first 7 years, that's not what they would naturally do. We all know that little children are on the move. They're on the move. And
I think that's so interesting because my two children that probably could have an ADHD diagnosis, because I knew what I knew, they didn't want to sit for a movie or a TV show. They were always so busy. And so it would have been better to just take them for a walk and get them exhausted before asking them to sit down, because they just needed to move. I mean, the great thing is those children aren't addicted to television or any kind of media at all, but it is very interesting, the space that we tend to put ourselves in with media. Parents are asking me all the time, is one show a day too much? I said, no, but how are you balancing it? How are you balancing that? Are you going, like I said, going for a walk first or going for a walk after? Are you, if they won't sit still, then they're trying to tell you something. They're telling you, hey, this isn't actually what I need right now. It might be what you need, mom, but it's not what I need right now. So what I need right now is for you to come outside with me and run around, or for you to get me a mini trampoline and let me jump up and down. Like all of those things, they need that. And it's so funny that we're having this conversation, because I was thinking over the last few days about all of the things that I know we did, even though I didn't know a lot about retained reflexes. We had a big trampoline in our yard for my older 3 children, and they were constantly on it and had that movement that I think is so, so important.
Absolutely.
So I want to go ahead and close this first part. In the second part, we're going to talk about some specific exercises, and we'll give some more resources. But I wanted to thank you so much for coming and sharing with us. This is, I think, for anybody who's listening and you've never heard of this before, I think this is a great opening of the door. Take this and run with it. I did do some like quick research, and there are plenty of videos on YouTube about retained reflexes. Go and look them up and see if they can be of help to you. Contact some of those places like the Handle Society. And there's another one that I saw yesterday that I cannot remember, but I will put it in our show notes. Like find these places so that you can understand the connections and then really work with them. And if your baby is in the sling all the time, lay them down and let them crawl. So thank you so much.
Find our Patreon at Auriel's Light. So Auriel's Light, if you haven't heard already,
is the ministry that we started this year, Interfaith. So we welcome people of all faiths to come and experience and converse and really get to know this conscious parenting space. I see it as a space for people that might be deeply into their religion, like being able to go deeper in what that parent-child relationship means. And then people that are just trying to figure out, like, what does this inner work journey mean to me? We're in that space, and I've been there trying to figure out, well, how do I bring what's welling up inside me to my children so that they aren't lost in confusion, so that they actually have this piece of goodness and beauty that Steiner always talks about. So the ministry has roots of anthroposophy, and we will be talking about things from an anthroposophical standpoint, but also really bringing you good content that you can bring into your life